My brother dragged me by the arm across the ballroom of Atlanta's most exclusive country club to meet his fiancée's multimillionaire father. He knocked over my glass of water in the process, not even caring as it shattered on the floor. He just wanted to humiliate me. Smirking, he shoved me forward and announced, "This is our family failure." My parents were right there nodding along and adding, "We do not brag about her." But the billionaire did not laugh. He looked at me, froze completely, and slowly lowered his drink. The color drained from his face as he bowed his head and said quietly, "So it is you. This is unexpected." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated your worth. I am Nia, 32 years old, and my entire life I have been the profound disappointment of the Washington family. Growing up in Atlanta, my parents cared about two things: their flawless reputation at our prominent church and their elite status among high society. Everything we did was a meticulously calculated performance. From the luxury cars leased just to keep up appearances to the manicured lawns of our suburban estate, our lives were completely curated for a judging audience. If you did not fit their strict mold of success, you were an absolute liability. I was their biggest liability. Tonight was my brother Marcus's crowning achievement. He was 35, a former medical student, and the undisputed golden child who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. He was marrying Chloe Sterling, whose main personality trait was her father's immense bank account. Richard Sterling was a white real estate tycoon, a ruthless billionaire who essentially owned half the city. For my parents, marrying into the Sterling family was the ultimate social victory. It was their golden ticket to the upper echelons of a world they had desperately clawed to be part of. The rehearsal dinner was held at the most exclusive country club in the state. The ballroom dripped in old money opulence. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over white silk linens and towering floral centerpieces. A jazz band played softly in the corner, their smooth melodies mingling with the clinking of expensive champagne flutes. I was seated at a tiny table near the kitchen swinging doors, far away from the elevated VIP section. I did not mind the isolation. I wore my simple emerald green pantsuit, sipping sparkling water and counting the painfully slow minutes until I could slip out the back door unseen. I had no desire to participate in the charade, and I knew my family preferred me hidden in the shadows anyway. But Marcus had entirely other plans. I did not see him coming until his heavy hand clamped down viciously on my shoulder. Startled, I jerked my arm and my glass of water tipped over, spilling a cold puddle across the pristine white tablecloth and splashing onto my sleeve. "Look at you making a mess as usual," Marcus sneered, his voice laced with venom. He yanked me up from my chair with enough aggressive force to make my heels stumble awkwardly on the polished marble floor. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to pull my wrist free from his tight grip. "You are going to pay your respects to Mr. Sterling," Marcus demanded, digging his fingers deeper into my skin as he dragged me forward. "You have been hiding back here all night, like a frightened stray dog. It is time you actually contributed to this family by showing some gratitude to the people funding this lavish weekend." Before I could pry his fingers off my arm, my mother suddenly materialized from the bustling crowd like a polished ghost. Beatrice wore a custom beaded gown that surely cost a small fortune. Her face was set in that terrifying artificial smile she exclusively used when she was furious, but holding an audience. She stepped directly into my path, raking her judgmental eyes over my emerald suit with visible disgust. "I specifically told you to wear the designer dress I bought you. Not this cheap rag," she hissed, her voice sharp enough to draw blood. "I bought my own clothes," I replied steadily, refusing to break eye contact. "You are a complete disgrace," Beatrice continued, stepping closer until her heavy floral perfume was suffocating me. "You could not even make it into my esteemed sorority. You dropped out of art school to paint graffiti in a damp basement. You have done absolutely nothing worthwhile with your life. The least you can do tonight is keep your mouth shut and not embarrass us. We are merging our legacy with a billionaire family, Nia. Do not ruin this incredible opportunity for your brother." My chest tightened with the familiar heavy ache of her lifelong rejection. The absolute truth was, she had no idea what I actually did for a living. She only knew I walked away from the prestigious law degree they aggressively forced upon me to choose art, a path they considered an embarrassing sentence to poverty. She did not know my perceived failure was actually my greatest blessing. Marcus tightened his bruising grip and pulled me past our mother. "She is coming with me," he told Beatrice over his shoulder. "I want Chloe's father to see the stark contrast. I want him to know exactly how far I have risen above the bottom feeders of this family." He dragged me forcefully toward the elevated VIP tables where the most important guests sat. Chloe stood there in a sparkling white cocktail dress, looking incredibly bored as she sipped her drink. Beside her stood Richard Sterling, a tall, imposing man with silver hair and cold, calculating eyes. He was in the middle of a serious conversation with another executive when Marcus aggressively shoved me forward. I stumbled slightly, catching my balance just inches from Richard's polished shoes. "Mr. Sterling," Marcus announced loudly, ensuring that all the surrounding tables fell completely silent. "I want to introduce you to my younger sister, Nia. She is our family failure. My parents and I usually do not mention her in public to avoid the embarrassment. She dropped out of school to finger paint in the dark, but we graciously let her attend tonight." Chloe let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed in the quiet space. "Oh, Daddy, this is the one I told you all about. She paints graffiti in her dead grandmother's extremely dirty basement. She is just a sad charity case for Marcus to look after. Do not let her ask you for a job." I stood tall, smoothing the wrinkles from my emerald suit. I did not look at the floor. I did not cry. I looked directly into Richard Sterling's cold eyes, waiting for the typical pity or swift, arrogant dismissal that incredibly wealthy men like him, usually reserved for invisible people like me. Instead, something truly incredible happened. Richard Sterling was holding his crystal glass of scotch. As his sharp eyes locked onto mine, his hand completely froze midair. The powerful, intimidating aura surrounding him vanished in an instant. All the color drained rapidly from his weathered face, leaving him as pale as a ghost. He completely ignored Marcus's outstretched hand and Chloe's continued laughter. Richard slowly lowered his glass, carefully setting it on the glass table with a visibly trembling hand. The sound of crystal clinking echoed sharply in the tense silence. He took a deeply respectful step back, bowed his head slightly toward me, and spoke in a quiet, unwavering voice. "So it is you," he breathed out, staring at me, as if I held his entire life and fortune in my bare hands. "This is unexpected." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. You could hear a pin drop on the polished marble floor. Marcus stood with his mouth slightly open, his grip on my arm, completely slackening as his brain desperately tried to process what was happening. My mother, Beatrice, looked as though she had been physically struck. Her artificial camera-ready smile melted into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. Richard Sterling, a man known for ruthlessly tearing apart corporate rivals before breakfast, was looking at me with a reverence usually reserved for royalty. "Mr. Sterling," Marcus stammered, trying to regain control of his carefully orchestrated humiliation. "I think there is a massive misunderstanding here. This is just Nia. She does not belong in your world." Richard did not even look at my brother. He kept his sharp, calculating eyes locked securely on mine. "There is no misunderstanding," Richard said, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. "Ladies and gentlemen, you may know her as Nia Washington. But in my world, the world of international fine art and high-stakes global acquisitions, she is known exclusively as NW Authentication. She is the single most feared, respected, and brilliantly ruthless undercover art appraiser on the entire East Coast." A collective gasp rippled through the surrounding tables. Wealthy guests leaned in, murmuring frantically to each other. My mother took a staggering step back, her manicured hand flying to her chest as if she could not catch her breath. But Chloe Sterling, completely oblivious to the massive shift in the room's power dynamic, let out another grating, high-pitched laugh. "Daddy, what are you talking about?" she whined, tossing her expensive blonde extensions over her shoulder. "She is a total loser. Marcus told me everything about her. She just paints ugly graffiti in her dead grandmother's extremely dirty basement. She is practically homeless and just looking for a handout. Richard whipped his head around to face his daughter. His eyes blazed with a fury so intense that Chloe physically recoiled, bumping into the table behind her. "Shut your mouth, Chloe!" Richard barked, his voice cracking like a whip across the silent ballroom. "You have absolutely no idea who you are speaking to. You are embarrassing yourself, and you are deeply embarrassing me." He turned his back on his trembling daughter and faced the crowd, his commanding presence demanding their absolute attention. Last month, my corporate board was hours away from finalizing a $50 million acquisition of a newly discovered Jean-Michel Basquiat painting. It was fully vetted by my experts. It had certificates of authenticity from 3 major European auction houses. We were ready to transfer the funds to an offshore account. But NW Authentication intercepted the sale. She bypassed my entire corporate security team, walked straight into my private office, and proved in under 10 minutes that the painting was a masterful, highly sophisticated forgery tied to an international money laundering ring. She single-handedly saved my entire corporation from a $50 million loss and a massive federal indictment that would have destroyed my legacy. Richard took a deep breath, turning his intense gaze toward my parents with absolute disgust. While you people were apparently mocking her for dropping out of law school and working in a basement, she was actually working deep undercover. She spent years immersing herself in the gritty, unseen underbelly of the art world. She studied the chemical compositions of forged paint, tracked down stolen masterpieces across continents, and built a global network of elite informants. She is a self-made ghost who holds the power to make or break billionaires with a single appraisal. And you brought her here tonight to humiliate her. You are the fools. The blood drained completely from Marcus's face. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the ground to hit him. Beatrice was visibly trembling, her eyes darting frantically around the room, watching the elite society she worshipped, suddenly looking at her with shock and utter disdain. They realized she had been relentlessly abusing a woman of immense power and wealth. Then my father decided to make his move. Thomas Washington had been quietly sipping his bourbon near the bar, watching the entire exchange unfold from a distance. Unlike my mother, who was driven purely by social climbing and appearances, my father was driven entirely by greed. He was a calculating man who could smell money from a mile away. Seeing Richard Sterling, a billionaire tycoon, bow down to his disgraced daughter, flipped a massive switch in his head. Suddenly, the father who had ignored my existence for a decade puffed out his chest and marched right into the center of the VIP section. He pushed past a paralyzed Marcus and threw a heavy, possessive arm around my shoulders. He flashed his brilliant, charismatic smile at Richard, and the crowd playing the role of the doting patriarch to absolute perfection. "Well, what can I say?" Thomas announced loudly, projecting his deep voice so everyone in the ballroom could hear him clearly. "That is my girl. I always knew she had a brilliant mind. She just needed time to find her unique path. The Washington business blood runs deep in her veins, Mr. Sterling. We are a family of winners, and Nia is the proof of our strong legacy." The sheer audacity of his performance made my stomach turn. For years, this man had looked right through me. He had refused to pay for my art supplies, told me I was a terrible investment, and mocked my life choices at every single holiday dinner. Now he wanted to claim my success as his own. He wanted to use my hard-earned reputation to elevate his own status in front of a billionaire and secure his place in this elite circle. I did not smile. I did not play along with his desperate charade. I violently shoved his heavy arm off my shoulder, stepping back to put a hard physical distance between us. The ballroom went dead silent once again, the tension so thick it felt hard to breathe. "Business blood?" I asked, my voice deadly calm, but loud enough to reach the very back of the room. "Is that what you call it, Thomas? Is that what you call it when you secretly drained my entire college savings account to pay off Marcus's fraternity gambling debts?" The charismatic smile plastered across my father's face completely collapsed. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The absolute silence in the ballroom shattered into a chaotic cacophony of gasps and furious whispering. Elite society members leaned across their white silk tables, their eyes darting between my father's horrified expression and my unwavering stare. Thomas Washington, the man who had spent his entire life projecting an image of untouchable wealth and moral superiority, looked exactly like the thief he truly was. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping into a waiter who was frozen in place. Marcus opened his mouth to defend our father, but the sheer panic in his eyes confirmed every single word I had just spoken. They thought I would stay silent forever. They thought the family secret was safely buried. That was when Chloe finally lost her mind. The reality that her perfect, highly publicized rehearsal dinner had been hijacked by her fiancé's scapegoat sister finally registered in her privileged brain. Her face flushed, an angry, blotchy red, clashing violently with her expensive dress. She stomped her heel on the marble floor, looking exactly like a spoiled toddler throwing a tantrum. "You are a liar!" Chloe shrieked, pointing a manicured, trembling finger directly at my face. "You are making all of this up just to ruin my weekend because you are jealous. Daddy, she is crazy. She must have manipulated your security team or hacked your corporate files. I want her out of here right now." She wildly scanned the perimeter of the room, her voice hitting a screeching pitch. "Security. Guards. Get this trash out of my dinner immediately." Richard Sterling did not move a single muscle to support his daughter. He did not signal the guards. He just watched me, his mind clearly turning gears, reevaluating everything Marcus had ever told him about the Washington family. The billionaire was realizing that he had backed the wrong horse. I did not even look at the security guards stepping hesitantly from the shadows along the walls. My eyes were entirely locked on Chloe. Specifically, my gaze was glued to the center of her plunging neckline. Pinned against the white silk of her designer dress, catching the light of the massive crystal chandeliers above, was a heavy, ornate ruby and gold vintage brooch. The air trapped itself in my lungs, and a hot flash of pure rage ignited in my chest. It was not just any piece of vintage jewelry. It was Big Mama's brooch. My late grandmother had worn that exact piece every single Sunday to church. It was her prized possession, and she had explicitly left it to me in her last will and testament. It was the only physical piece of her I had left in the world, and it had mysteriously vanished from my bedroom drawer the week before I officially moved out of my parents' house. They told me I must have lost it. I stepped right past my paralyzed father and walked directly into Chloe's personal space. My voice dropped to a lethal, icy calm that cut through her hysterical screaming. "Take off Big Mama's brooch! Now!" Chloe instinctively covered the large ruby with her hand, her eyes wide with sudden fear at my tone. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, taking a step backward until she bumped into her father's arm. "Marcus gave this to me." My mother Beatrice lunged forward, grabbing my arm with trembling, manicured fingers. "Nia, stop this instant!" She hissed, her voice vibrating with sheer panic and desperation. "I gave it to her. I gave it to Chloe as her something old for the wedding tradition." Marcus needed a significant family heirloom to prove our long-standing legacy to her family. "You never wore it anyway. It was just gathering dust in a box. You do not even appreciate fine things." I slowly turned my head to look at my mother. I did not pull my arm away. I just stared at her hand until she released me, shrinking back from the look in my eyes. The absolute disgust I felt for her in that moment was suffocating. "You stole my dead grandmother's jewelry, the only thing she explicitly wanted me to have, just to play dress-up for your wealthy white in-laws," I asked, my voice echoing loudly in the dead silent room. "You stripped me of my heritage so your golden boy could pretend he came from a long line of generational wealth. You let me believe I had lost the one thing Big Mama gave me just to buy Chloe's approval." Marcus desperately stepped between Chloe and me, holding his hands up like a referee trying to stop a brawl before it turned bloody. "Nia, please," he begged, his voice stripped of all its previous arrogance. The confident golden child was gone, replaced by a terrified con artist whose house of cards was collapsing. "Do not do this here. We can talk about the jewelry, the college fund, all of it privately. Just walk away tonight. I will write you a check tomorrow for whatever you want. Please just leave. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into the pocket of my emerald suit and pulled out my phone. I ignored Marcus completely, stepping around his trembling frame, and locked my eyes back on the billionaire standing rigidly beside his daughter. I tapped my screen twice, opening a highly secured digital file I had prepared weeks ago, and turned the phone so only Richard Sterling could clearly read the bright screen. "Mr. Sterling," I said, clearly ensuring the words carried perfectly across the entire hushed ballroom. "Ask your future son-in-law what collateral he used to secure the $15 million loan you gave him for his new real estate firm." The suffocating silence returned heavier and darker than before. Thomas Washington's mouth snapped shut. The jovial, commanding patriarch act vanished instantly, replaced by the panicked, wide-eyed stare of a man caught red-handed in broad daylight. He dropped his arm from the empty air where I had just been standing and took a slow, cowardly step backward, melting into the periphery, as if trying to erase his own existence. Richard Sterling did not miss a single micro-expression. The billionaire slowly turned his head, his sharp gaze dragging away from my cowardly father and locking directly onto Marcus. The ambient temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Richard was a man who had built a global empire by systematically destroying liars, frauds, and corporate parasites. He was currently looking at my brother as if he were a diseased rat that had scurried onto a Michelin-starred dining table. If Marcus had secretly stolen his own sister's college fund to cover illicit gambling debts, what else had he stolen? Marcus was actively disintegrating under the billionaire's scrutiny. Heavy, rolling beads of sweat broke out across his forehead, shining slickly under the glare of the crystal chandeliers. His expensive, custom-tailored tuxedo suddenly looked too big for him, hanging off his shoulders like a cheap costume. Panic seized his features. He darted forward, grabbing Chloe by the wrist with a frantic, uncoordinated motion that made her stumble in her designer heels. "We are leaving," Marcus stammered, his voice jumping a full octave as he tried to physically drag his bewildered fiancée toward the grand mahogany exit doors. "Chloe, come with me right now. We are going upstairs. My sister is having a complete mental breakdown. She is delusional. She is sick. We do not need to stand here and listen to this insane garbage." Chloe dug her expensive heels into the polished marble floor, violently yanking her arm out of his frantic grasp. The reality that her perfect, highly publicized rehearsal dinner was rapidly turning into a spectacular crime scene was finally registering. "Let go of me, Marcus. You are hurting my wrist," she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the tables. "What is she talking about, Daddy? Do something, he is hurting me." Richard did not signal his guards to help his daughter. He handled it himself. He stepped directly into Marcus's path, blocking the exit like a solid wall of pure intimidation. He did not yell. He did not have to. He simply projected an aura of absolute terrifying authority that rooted Marcus to the spot. "You are not going anywhere, Marcus," Richard said, his voice dangerously soft, carrying a lethal edge that sent a shiver down the spines of the guests standing nearby. "You are going to stand exactly where you are, and you are going to answer her question right here in front of me and in front of everyone you invited to this room." Cornered, publicly humiliated, and facing the wrath of a billionaire, Marcus resorted to the only defense mechanism he had ever known. He fell back on the toxic, unyielding entitlement our parents had spoon-fed him since the day he was born. He puffed out his chest, attempting to physically loom over the situation to assert his crumbling dominance. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger at me, his face twisting into an ugly, defensive sneer. "I am the eldest son of the Washington family," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking frantically as he tried to project power. "I did what I had to do for the financial legacy of this family. I used the ancestral estate to secure my business. That land in Georgia has been in our name for 4 generations. It is mine by right. I am the male heir." Beatrice, sensing her golden child slipping away, immediately rushed forward, nodding vigorously in agreement with his absurd confession. "He is the firstborn son, Mr. Sterling," she cried out, looking desperately at Richard, begging him to understand their twisted logic. "It is his birthright to use family resources to build his empire." Nia is just a girl. She was going to waste that college money on art degrees and useless, unprofitable hobbies. Marcus needed that capital for real business. It was for the good of the family name. Their blatant, shameless justification of theft was so deeply repulsive that I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It was a cold, piercing sound that cut right through their pathetic, patriarchal excuses. That laugh snapped the very last remaining thread of Marcus's sanity. The realization that I was utterly unafraid of him, that his lifelong intimidation tactics no longer worked, sent him into a blind rage. His eyes went wide and feral. He lunged across the open space between us, raising his hand high, fully intending to strike me across the face and physically silence the woman who was dismantling his entire fraudulent existence. "Shut your mouth, you worthless little—" He never finished the sentence. Before Marcus could get within 3 feet of me, 2 massive men in tailored black suits materialized seemingly out of thin air. Richard Sterling's private security detail moved with brutal, lethal precision. One guard grabbed Marcus by the lapels of his custom tuxedo, lifting his polished shoes slightly off the floor, while the other shoved his chest backward with tremendous force. Marcus flew backward, completely airborne for a split second before crashing hard into a nearby VIP cocktail table. Silver trays, crystal champagne flutes, and massive floral arrangements shattered across the marble floor in a deafening crash as he collapsed into a pathetic groaning heap of ruined silk and spilled liquor. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply looked down at my brother thrashing amidst the broken glass and spilled champagne, then calmly turned my attention back to the billionaire standing beside me. I reached into the inner pocket of my emerald suit jacket and pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen, opening a highly secured encrypted digital file I had meticulously prepared for this exact moment. I turned the bright screen outward, holding it up so Richard Sterling could clearly read the official government seal, the timestamp, and the bold black text of the digital property deed. I smiled warmly at the furious billionaire delivering the final devastating blow. "He used Big Mama's estate, yes," I said, my voice ringing cleanly through the groans of my brother and the horrified gasps of the wedding guests. "But unfortunately for you, Mr. Sterling Marcus does not own a single inch of that land. I do. And he forged my signature on your federal loan documents to secure that $15 million loan you gave him." The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse suite at the Four Seasons. I was standing on the balcony savoring the crisp morning air and a perfectly brewed cup of black coffee. The chaotic fallout of the rehearsal dinner still buzzed in my phone, which I had left silenced on the kitchen island. Richard Sterling had immediately frozen Marcus's assets, pending a brutal corporate investigation, and the wedding was hanging by a precarious thread. A sharp, aggressive pounding on my hotel room door shattered the morning peace. I did not rush. I took another sip of my coffee, tightened the belt of my silk robe, and walked casually to the entryway. I swung the heavy oak door open to find my mother Beatrice standing in the hallway. Her usually flawless hair was slightly frizzy, and the heavy bags under her eyes betrayed a completely sleepless night. But she was not alone. Standing right beside her, clutching a worn leather Bible and looking profoundly uncomfortable, was Reverend Jenkins from our family church in Atlanta. This was a calculated ambush. "Nia, we need to come inside right now," Beatrice demanded, her voice tight with suppressed panic. She pushed past me without waiting for an invitation, dragging the bewildered pastor into my private suite. Reverend Jenkins offered a weak, apologetic smile. "Good morning, Nia. Your mother called me in the middle of the night. She is in deep distress. We came here to pray together and find a path of healing for this family." I closed the door, slowly leaning against the frame. "I am not interested in a prayer circle, Reverend. I am interested in knowing why my mother dragged you out of bed on the morning of my brother's wedding." Beatrice slammed her designer handbag onto my glass coffee table. She unzipped it with frantic, jerky movements and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She shoved them onto the glass surface, tapping the top page with a trembling, manicured finger. "You are going to sign this retroactive deed transfer?" Beatrice ordered, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. "You are going to sign it right now and date it for 2 years ago." Reverend Jenkins is here to witness the signature and notarize it as a trusted community leader. If you sign this, it legally proves that Marcus had your full permission to use the Georgia estate as collateral. It turns a federal forgery charge into a simple family misunderstanding. Reverend Jenkins nodded solemnly, clasping his hands tightly together. Nia, the Bible teaches us about grace and forgiveness. Marcus made a grave error in judgment, but sending your own flesh and blood to federal prison is a burden your soul should not carry. Think of your parents. Think of the shame this will bring to the Washington name. We must protect the family. I stared at the pastor, feeling a cold, heavy wave of absolute disgust. They were actually using a man of faith to guilt-trip me into committing federal perjury to cover up a multi-million-dollar fraud. I walked over to the coffee table, glancing down at the immaculate stack of papers. I did not pick them up. I looked back at my mother, who was vibrating with sheer desperation. "Why did he do it?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. Why did Marcus need $15 million so badly that he would risk federal prison? You and Dad have been bragging for years about his massive real estate empire. You told everyone he was a self-made millionaire. The pristine, perfect church lady facade that Beatrice had meticulously maintained for my entire life instantly fractured into a million jagged pieces. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. She slammed both hands down on the glass table, leaning over the unsigned papers with wild, bloodshot eyes. "Because there is no empire!" Beatrice screamed, her voice echoing violently off the penthouse walls. "The veneer of generational wealth we built is completely hollow. Big Mama let that house go into tax foreclosure 5 years ago. She was broke. She could not afford the property taxes, and she refused to ask for our help. When she died, the city was weeks away from seizing the land. Marcus just took the tax money to survive. He had to leverage the estate to keep his shell companies afloat. We had to maintain our image. If the country club found out we were bankrupt, we would be ruined socially and financially." Reverend Jenkins took a horrified step backward, clutching his Bible to his chest, as if to shield himself from the sudden, unapologetic onslaught of confessed financial crimes. He looked at Beatrice like he did not even recognize the woman who sat in his front pew every single Sunday. "You let me believe my grandmother left me absolutely nothing," I said, the bitter reality settling heavily into my bones. "You let me believe she died penniless and forgot about me, all while Marcus was using her stolen land to fund his fake luxury lifestyle and impress Chloe Sterling and her billionaire father. It is a rotting house on a useless plot of dirt." Beatrice shrieked, tears of sheer panic finally spilling down her perfectly contoured cheeks. "It means nothing compared to what Marcus is trying to build. You are going to destroy this entire family's legacy over a rotting house. Sign the papers, Nia. Save your brother. Save us." I stood in absolute silence, absorbing the pathetic reality of my family's existence. They were not elite. They were not royalty. They were drowning in debt and lies, and they fully expected me to become their sacrificial life raft. I picked up my coffee mug from the kitchen island. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the bitter, dark roast wash over my tongue. I walked back to the coffee table and set the mug down directly on top of the retroactive deed transfer, leaving a dark, wet ring right over the signature line. "I will not be signing anything, Mother." Beatrice let out a strangled, desperate sob, reaching out to grab my shoulders, but I took a sharp step back out of her reach. And since you are in a confessing mood, I continued, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of all emotion. "Let me clarify exactly how much danger your golden boy is actually in. I didn't just buy the house back from the city, Mother. I bought the bank debt tied to Marcus's shell company. I am now his sole creditor." The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse suite at the Four Seasons. I was standing on the balcony, savoring the crisp morning air and a perfectly brewed cup of black coffee. The chaotic fallout of the rehearsal dinner still buzzed in my phone, which I had left silenced on the kitchen island. Richard Sterling had immediately frozen Marcus's assets pending a brutal corporate investigation, and the wedding was hanging by a precarious thread. A sharp, aggressive pounding on my hotel room door shattered the morning peace. I did not rush. I took another sip of my coffee, tightened the belt of my silk robe, and walked casually to the entryway. I swung the heavy oak door open to find my mother Beatrice standing in the hallway. Her usually flawless hair was slightly frizzy, and the heavy bags under her eyes betrayed a completely sleepless night. But she was not alone. Standing right beside her, clutching a worn leather Bible and looking profoundly uncomfortable, was Reverend Jenkins from our family church in Atlanta. This was a calculated ambush. "Naya, we need to come inside right now," Beatrice demanded, her voice tight with suppressed panic. She pushed past me without waiting for an invitation, dragging the bewildered pastor into my private suite. Reverend Jenkins offered a weak apologetic smile. "Good morning, Nia. Your mother called me in the middle of the night. She is in deep distress. We came here to pray together and find a path of healing for this family." I closed the door slowly, leaning against the frame. "I am not interested in a prayer circle, Reverend. I am interested in knowing why my mother dragged you out of bed on the morning of my brother's wedding." Beatrice slammed her designer handbag onto my glass coffee table. She unzipped it with frantic, jerky movements and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She shoved them onto the glass surface, tapping the top page with a trembling, manicured finger. "You are going to sign this retroactive deed transfer," Beatrice ordered, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. "You are going to sign it right now and date it for 2 years ago. Reverend Jenkins is here to witness the signature and notarize it as a trusted community leader. If you sign this, it legally proves that Marcus had your full permission to use the Georgia estate as collateral. It turns a federal forgery charge into a simple family misunderstanding." Reverend Jenkins nodded solemnly, clasping his hands tightly together. "Nia, the Bible teaches us about grace and forgiveness. Marcus made a grave error in judgment, but sending your own flesh and blood to federal prison is a burden your soul should not carry. Think of your parents. Think of the shame this will bring to the Washington name. We must protect the family." I stared at the pastor, feeling a cold, heavy wave of absolute disgust. They were actually using a man of faith to guilt-trip me into committing federal perjury to cover up a multi-million-dollar fraud. I walked over to the coffee table, glancing down at the immaculate stack of papers. I did not pick them up. I looked back at my mother, who was vibrating with sheer desperation. "Why did he do it?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "Why did Marcus need $15 million so badly that he would risk federal prison? You and Dad have been bragging for years about his massive real estate empire. You told everyone he was a self-made millionaire." The pristine, perfect church lady facade that Beatrice had meticulously maintained for my entire life instantly fractured into a million jagged pieces. Her face contorted into a mask of pure ugly rage. She slammed both hands down on the glass table, leaning over the unsigned papers with wild, bloodshot eyes. "Because there is no empire," Beatrice screamed, her voice echoing violently off the penthouse walls. "The veneer of generational wealth we built is completely hollow. Big Mama let that house go into tax foreclosure 5 years ago. She was broke. She could not afford the property taxes, and she refused to ask for our help. When she died, the city was weeks away from seizing the land. Marcus just took the tax money to survive. He had to leverage the estate to keep his shell companies afloat. We had to maintain our image. If the country club found out we were bankrupt, we would be ruined socially and financially." Reverend Jenkins took a horrified step backward, clutching his Bible to his chest, as if to shield himself from the sudden, unapologetic onslaught of confessed financial crimes. He looked at Beatrice like he did not even recognize the woman who sat in his front pew every single Sunday. "You let me believe my grandmother left me absolutely nothing," I said, the bitter reality settling heavily into my bones. "You let me believe she died penniless and forgot about me, all while Marcus was using her stolen land to fund his fake luxury lifestyle and impress Chloe Sterling and her billionaire father." "It is a rotting house on a useless plot of dirt," Beatrice shrieked, tears of sheer panic finally spilling down her perfectly contoured cheeks. "It means nothing compared to what Marcus is trying to build. You are going to destroy this entire family's legacy over a rotting house. Sign the papers, Nia. Save your brother. Save us." I stood in absolute silence, absorbing the pathetic reality of my family's existence. They were not elite. They were not royalty. They were drowning in debt and lies, and they fully expected me to become their sacrificial life raft. I picked up my coffee mug from the kitchen island. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the bitter, dark roast wash over my tongue. I walked back to the coffee table and set the mug down directly on top of the retroactive deed transfer, leaving a dark, wet ring right over the signature line. "I will not be signing anything, Mother." Beatrice let out a strangled, desperate sob, reaching out to grab my shoulders, but I took a sharp step back out of her reach. And since you are in a confessing mood, I continued, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of all emotion. "Let me clarify exactly how much danger your golden boy is actually in. I didn't just buy the house back from the city, Mother. I bought the bank debt tied to Marcus's shell company. I am now his sole creditor." 2 hours after leaving my mother and the pastor in a state of absolute hyperventilating shock inside my penthouse, my private driver pulled up to the curb of the historic Grand Cathedral. The sheer, unadulterated financial waste on display was genuinely staggering. Marcus and Chloe had transformed the centuries-old stone courtyard into a ridiculous spectacle of fake royalty. Massive arches of imported white orchids lined the sweeping marble staircase. A 12-piece string quartet played classical music near the valet stand, where a fleet of rented luxury cars was being hurriedly parked. It was a perfectly staged theatrical production funded entirely by stolen money and federal wire fraud. I stepped out of my car, smoothing the lines of my tailored charcoal blazer. I did not rush. I walked up the wide marble steps with the slow, measured pace of an apex predator stepping into its own territory. As I reached the massive, intricately carved oak doors of the cathedral vestibule, a wall of solid muscle suddenly blocked my path. 3 private security contractors stood shoulder to shoulder. They wore tactical black suits, secure earpieces, and expressions of practiced intimidation. The man in the center, clearly the head of the security detail, stepped forward. He raised a massive, heavy hand and placed it firmly against my chest, physically halting my momentum. "You need to step back, ma'am," the guard ordered, his voice a low, threatening rumble. "This is a private, highly secured event. You are explicitly on the restricted list. You need to leave the premises immediately, or we will be forced to physically remove you." I glanced down at his hand resting against my jacket, completely unfazed by his attempted show of force. Before I could instruct him to remove it, the heavy oak doors swung open. Chloe stepped into the sunlight. She looked exactly like a plastic decoration on top of a cheap wedding cake. She was buried under layers of blindingly white custom-designed silk and imported French lace. Her bridesmaids fluttered nervously behind her, carrying the massive train of her dress. When Chloe spotted me standing at the bottom of the steps, her eyes lit up with a malicious, deeply satisfied glee. This was exactly the scenario she had been hoping for. She thought she had the ultimate upper hand. "Hold on, Vance," Chloe called out to the head security guard, waving her manicured hand dismissively. "Let her stay right there for a second. I want her to see what she is missing." Chloe strutted forward, stopping just behind the line of armed guards. She looked down at me from the top of the marble stairs, her lips curling into a vicious, deeply ugly sneer. The mask of the polite, cultured socialite completely evaporated, revealing the profound prejudice and arrogant entitlement that Marcus was so desperate to marry into. "I told Marcus you would try to show up here and beg for a handout," Chloe sneered, her voice dripping with sheer condescension. "He warned me that you were completely unhinged, but this is just pathetic. Look at you. You actually thought you could walk into a place like this and cause a scene." She leaned forward, dropping her voice so only I and the guards could hear her. The absolute malice in her eyes was glaring. "You do not belong in spaces like this!" "Nia," Chloe spat, looking me up and down with blatant, undisguised disgust. "You are a complete embarrassment to Marcus. You will never be part of my family's world. Go back to the hood where you belong before I have these men drag you to the curb." I did not yell. I did not flinch. I did not even blink. I just looked at her with the cold, clinical detachment of someone observing a particularly loud insect. The Washington family was so desperate to be accepted by people like Chloe that they were willing to strip me of my heritage, steal from our own grandmother, and throw me to the wolves. They had sold their souls to appease a family that viewed them as nothing more than entertaining charity cases. I slowly shifted my gaze away from Chloe's flushed, angry face and looked directly at the head of security. I registered the specific gold crest embroidered on the lapel of his tactical jacket. It was a crest I knew intimately. Without breaking eye contact with the massive guard, I calmly reached into my designer handbag. I bypassed my wallet and pulled out a solid matte black metal card. It was heavy, completely unmarked, except for a small, deeply engraved gold crest in the very center. It was the exact same crest that was currently pinned to his uniform. I held the heavy metal badge up and pressed it flat against the center of his chest. The security guard glanced down, clearly annoyed, fully intending to slap my hand away. But the moment his eyes registered the gold crest and the specific serial code engraved beneath it, the air completely vanished from his lungs. The aggressive, intimidating posture melted off his body in a single terrifying second. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale white. His eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated horror. He instantly yanked his hand away from my chest, as if my jacket had suddenly caught fire. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing frantically, and took a sharp, highly disciplined step backward. Without a single word of hesitation, the massive man folded his body perfectly in half, dipping into a deep, subservient bow. The two guards flanking him immediately noticed his panic, recognized the badge in my hand, and mirrored his exact posture, stepping far away from the heavy oak doors. Chloe's victorious smirk shattered. She stared at the bowing security guards in total bewilderment, her hands clutching the expensive silk of her wedding gown. "What are you doing?" Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking with sudden, uncontrollable panic. "I am paying you to keep her out. Grab her. Throw her off the property right now. That is an order." The guards did not move an inch. They remained frozen with their heads bowed, absolutely refusing to look at Chloe or follow her frantic commands. I stepped smoothly past the line of terrified men and walked up to the very top of the marble stairs, forcing Chloe to take a stumbling step backward into the cathedral vestibule. I looked her up and down, taking in the trembling mess of white lace and sheer panic. "He is not going to touch me, Chloe," I said, my voice carrying a lethal, echoing authority that made her bridesmaids physically recoil. "He works for Vanguard Global Protection. Vanguard is a subsidiary of my holding company." I smiled, letting the terrifying reality of the situation crash over her. "He works for my holding company. I own this venue, and I am shutting this wedding down." I left Chloe standing in the vestibule, her mouth opening and closing in mute, suffocating horror as the massive security guards continued to bow toward me. Her shrill demands died in her throat, completely neutralized by the undeniable reality that she had no power here. I did not give her a second glance. I pushed my way past the heavy velvet-lined inner doors and stepped directly into the sanctuary. The timing could not have been more perfectly poetic. High above in the grand loft, the cathedral organist saw the doors swing open. Assuming the bride was finally making her grand entrance, his hands slammed down on the keys. The massive booming chords of the traditional wedding march immediately filled the cavernous stone sanctuary, vibrating through the floorboards and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. As one synchronized entity, 200 of Atlanta's most elite, wealthy, and influential citizens rose to their feet and turned toward the back of the church. They expected to see a vision in white lace. They expected the culmination of a high society merger between the sterling billions and the Washington real estate empire. Instead, they saw me. I stood at the top of the center aisle in my sharp, tailored emerald suit, my posture straight and my expression completely devoid of mercy. A collective audible gasp rippled through the pews. The murmurs began instantly, a chaotic wave of panicked whispers, spreading like wildfire among the venture capitalists, country club socialites, and hedge fund managers. They stared in utter bewilderment. I did not pause to let them process the shock. I began my slow, measured stride down the long, white runner, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor, cutting through the heavy organ music. In the front row, I saw my mother Beatrice freeze entirely, her face drained of all color, her hands flying up to cover her mouth, as she realized her worst nightmare was unfolding in broad daylight. Beside her sat Richard Sterling. The billionaire patriarch did not look confused. His sharp, calculating eyes locked onto me, his mind instantly analyzing the complete failure of his security detail and the terrifying confidence in my stride. But it was my father who reacted first. Thomas Washington had spent his entire life building an empire of lies, ruling our family with an iron fist and demanding absolute, unquestioning submission. Seeing his despised, cast-aside daughter actively destroying his crowning social achievement was more than his fragile ego could process. He snapped. Thomas rushed out of the front pew, his face flushed a dark, dangerous red. He completely ignored the murmuring crowd and the booming wedding march, stepping directly into the center aisle to intercept me. He moved with the aggressive, heavy momentum of a man used to physical intimidation. He lunged forward and grabbed me roughly by the wrist. His fingers dug into my skin, attempting to utilize the same physical dominance that had kept me quiet and compliant throughout my entire childhood. He leaned in close, attempting to use his booming deacon voice to shame me into submission while maintaining a facade of righteous authority. "You are disobeying God and your father," Thomas hissed, his voice vibrating with desperate religious fury. "Submit to your family." 10 years ago, that grip would have paralyzed me. 10 years ago, the invocation of divine punishment and parental authority would have sent me shrinking back into the shadows to protect the Washington name. But I was no longer the scared, vulnerable girl he had emotionally starved and cast aside. I was the woman who owned the ground he was currently standing on. I looked down at his hand gripping my wrist. Then I looked him dead in the eyes. I twisted my arm with a sharp, practiced motion, easily and violently breaking his physical grip. I did not whisper my response. I projected my voice, making sure it carried cleanly over the organ music, loud enough for the first 3 rows of elite guests to hear every single syllable. "God didn't tell you to forge a signature, Thomas." The reaction was instantaneous and devastating. The murmurs in the front rows completely ceased, replaced by a stunned, electrifying silence. Beatrice let out a strangled, breathless choke, collapsing back into her pew. Richard Sterling's posture instantly changed. The billionaire sat up rigid and straight, his eyes narrowing into dangerous slits as the word forge echoed in his ears. He was a man who had just lent $15 million to the Washington family. He was currently piecing the puzzle together, and he smelled blood in the water. Thomas stumbled backward, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. I had not just rejected his authority. I had stripped him of his title, calling him by his first name, and publicly exposed his federal crime in front of the very people he worshipped. He looked incredibly small, a hollow, pathetic man realizing his entire world was collapsing. I did not wait for him to recover. I stepped around his frozen body and continued my march toward the altar. Marcus was standing under the massive floral archway, sweating profusely through his custom-tailored tuxedo. He looked like a cornered animal facing a firing squad. His eyes were wide with pure terror, his breathing shallow and erratic. He opened his mouth, raising a trembling hand as if to beg for mercy, to plead for the sister he had robbed and humiliated to somehow save him. I bypassed Marcus entirely. I did not even grant him the dignity of eye contact. I walked right past my brother as if he were nothing more than a piece of cheap furniture. I stopped directly in front of the officiating pastor. The elderly man was clutching his leather-bound Bible to his chest, looking back and forth between me, the frozen groom, and the chaotic congregation with absolute bewilderment. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. The heavy paper contained the certified, irrefutable proof of the Washington family's financial ruin, the forged federal loan documents, and the digital deed to the Georgia estate that I legally owned. I held the envelope out, pressing it firmly against the pastor's chest until he reflexively took it from my hands. I stared him down, my voice ringing out with absolute undeniable authority. "Read page 4 to the congregation, pastor, or I'll have the police do it." Marcus snapped out of his terror-induced paralysis. Survival instinct overrode his shock, transforming his fear into a blind, desperate panic. He lunged across the altar, his hands outstretched like a feral animal aiming directly for the trembling pastor. He screamed for the elderly man to hand over the envelope, his voice cracking and echoing wildly against the vaulted stone ceilings. But he was not fast enough. Richard Sterling moved with a brutal, predatory speed that completely defied his age. The billionaire patriarch stepped right past his frozen daughter and intercepted Marcus effortlessly. He clamped a massive, heavy hand onto Marcus's shoulder, shoving the groom backward with enough force to send him stumbling into the ornate floral archway. With his other hand, Richard snatched the manila envelope directly from the pastor's grip. Richard did not ask for permission. He tore the heavy seal open, ripping the thick paper with a violent tearing sound that cut through the dead silent sanctuary. He pulled out the thick stack of bound documents. The crest of a top-tier, internationally recognized forensic accounting firm was stamped clearly across the header. He flipped directly to page 4. The ambient temperature in the room seemed to plummet. 200 of the most powerful people in Atlanta held their collective breath, watching the patriarch of the Sterling Empire scan the pages. The initial confusion on Richard's face melted away rapidly, replaced by a dark, murderous, terrifying rage. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. When he finally looked up from the paper, his gaze was absolutely lethal. Richard did not whisper. He projected his voice with the booming, unyielding authority of a man who destroyed corporate lives for a living. He read the itemized list aloud, letting every single syllable fall like a hammer blow upon my family. He read the exact routing numbers. He read the offshore wire transfers. He detailed exactly how the $15 million commercial development loan money, entirely funded by the Sterling Holding Group, was systematically siphoned into dummy corporations in the Cayman Islands. The elite crowd gasped in unison as Richard read the ultimate destinations of those funds. Marcus had not purchased a single acre of commercial real estate. He had not poured concrete for a single foundation. Instead, the audit laid bare a massive, sprawling network of high-stakes gambling debts. Millions of dollars had simply evaporated at VIP baccarat tables in Macau. Millions more were completely lost to illicit sports betting syndicates across Europe. But the humiliation did not stop there. Richard's eyes burned with furious disgust as he moved down the page, exposing the pathetic reality of the golden boy image my parents had worshipped for decades. The fleet of exotic cars Marcus paraded around the country club, the ones my father boasted about at every holiday dinner, were short-term, high-interest leases paid for with stolen sterling capital. The luxury penthouse he claimed to own was a month-to-month rental registered under a fake corporate identity. The custom-tailored suits, the vintage Rolex, watches, the lavish, breathtaking gifts he had showered upon Chloe to win her affection, everything was funded by federal wire fraud. My brother was not a real estate mogul. He was a degenerate, desperate gambling addict playing dress-up with a billionaire's money. The silence in the cathedral was suffocating, broken only by the sound of Beatrice letting out a high, thin wail of pure agony from the front pew. The entire foundation of her elite social standing was being publicly eviscerated, dismantled piece by piece, in front of every single person she desperately wanted to impress. The venture capitalists and hedge fund managers in the pews were already pulling out their phones, texting their brokers and legal teams. The Washington family name was officially toxic. Thomas sat completely frozen, his eyes glazed over, staring blankly at the polished marble floor as his patriarchal dominance shattered into worthless dust. At the altar, the reality finally registered in Chloe's mind. The cruel, classist smirk she had worn in the vestibule was entirely gone. She looked at Marcus, her eyes wide with a horrifying realization. She was not marrying a titan of industry. She was tying herself to a broke, fraudulent criminal who had just stolen a fortune from her own father. Chloe dropped her custom silk bouquet, the imported white orchids scattered across the cold stone steps. She spun around her heavy wedding gown, twisting violently around her legs, and delivered a sharp, ringing slap directly across Marcus's face. The crack of her hand against his cheek echoed like a gunshot through the church. "You lied to me!" Chloe screamed, her voice entirely stripped of its cultured refinement. She burst into hysterical, ugly tears, stepping forward to strike his chest with her fists. "You are nothing. You are a complete fraud. You humiliated me in front of everyone." Marcus cowered, throwing his arms up to shield his face, sobbing pathetically as his bride continued to strike him. He looked incredibly small, a hollow shell of the arrogant bully who had tormented me my entire life. All those years of being called a disappointment, all those years of being pushed aside so my parents could fund his illusions, all of it culminated in this exact moment of absolute ruin. I stood perfectly still, watching the destruction unfold with cold, clinical vindication. But Richard Sterling ignored his daughter's hysterical breakdown. He ignored the groom cowering on the altar. He slowly lowered the forensic audit, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the heavy paper. He looked past Marcus, past the weeping Beatrice, and past the utterly defeated Thomas. His sharp, predatory gaze locked directly onto me. Richard was a ruthless businessman. He recognized the specific legal formatting of the document in his hand. He saw the certified government stamps pressed into the bottom corner of the pages. A terrifying realization dawned on the billionaire as he pieced together the ultimate scope of my revenge. He stepped forward, the audit trembling slightly in his massive hand. He ignored the chaotic murmurs of the crowd, speaking directly to me, with a voice entirely drained of its previous fury, replaced by a cold, dawning shock. "You didn't just give me an audit," Richard said, his voice trembling as the sheer magnitude of the situation settled over him. "You forwarded this to the IRS, didn't you?" I did not break eye contact with the furious billionaire. "I forwarded the entire unredacted file to the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS at exactly 8 o'clock this morning," I replied, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity. "Federal wire fraud, international money laundering, and aggravated tax evasion. By the time the organist stops playing, Marcus's accounts will be frozen, and the federal warrants will be signed." The acronym IRS acted like a live grenade thrown directly into the middle of the cathedral. Total, unadulterated pandemonium broke out. The polite, hushed whispers of the elite congregation erupted into outright shouting. The veneer of high society elegance vanished in a matter of seconds. Men in custom tuxedos scrambled out of the mahogany pews, aggressively shouting into their cell phones, desperate to contact their brokers and legal teams to distance their own portfolios from the impending Sterling and Washington fallout. The string quartet had long since stopped playing. The pristine, floral-scented air was suddenly thick with panic sweat and the absolute collapse of a fraudulent empire. Chloe spun away from her ruined groom. Her face was contorted with a vicious, unhinged fury. She did not direct her wrath at the federal government, or even at Richard. She turned her sights directly onto my parents. She violently hiked up the skirt of her ridiculous $100,000 wedding gown and stomped down the marble steps of the altar toward Thomas and Beatrice. "You absolute parasites!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly over the chaos of the fleeing guests. "You disgusting Section 8 frauds! You crawled out of the gutter and tried to infect my family with your ghetto poverty." Her words were dripping with venomous, racially coded malice. The polite, cultured socialite mask completely evaporated, revealing the deeply ingrained repulsive bigotry that the Washington family had been so desperate to align themselves with. "My father gave you a seat at the table," Chloe screamed, her face flushed and twisted with hatred. "We let you into our country clubs, we let you breathe our air, and you stole from us like common street thugs." Thomas stood paralyzed. His jaw worked uselessly as his entire patriarchal dominance was publicly shredded by a 24-year-old heiress. The man who ruled his own home with an iron fist, who demanded absolute submission from his daughter, was completely silent in the face of white billionaire wealth. But Beatrice reacted exactly as she had been programmed to act her entire life. She bowed to the money. My mother. The woman who had demanded absolute perfection from me. The woman who had scrutinized every flaw in my existence to ensure we looked elite to the outside world, actually dropped to her knees on the cold marble floor. "Chloe, please, you must understand." Beatrice sobbed. She crawled forward, reaching out with trembling, frantic hands to grab the delicate lace hem of Chloe's wedding dress. Marcus loves you. He just wanted to give you the life you deserve. He just wanted to be worthy of your world. He wanted to be a real Sterling. Please do not leave him. We will pay it back. We will do anything you ask. It was the most pathetic, undignified display I had ever witnessed in my entire life. Beatrice was actively stripping away her own humanity. She was sacrificing her pride, her dignity, and her self-respect to keep her golden child anchored to a billionaire's wealth. She was groveling at the feet of a woman who viewed her as nothing more than a racial stereotype and a financial parasite. Chloe looked down at my weeping mother with absolute unmasked revulsion. With a sharp, violent motion, Chloe kicked her expensive satin heel forward. She physically struck Beatrice's outstretched hands, knocking my mother's grasp away from her pristine gown. "Get your filthy hands off my dress!" Chloe snarled, stepping back in pure disgust. "You and your pathetic son are going to rot in a federal cell." I moved before my mother could completely humiliate herself any further. I did not step forward out of love for Beatrice. I felt no urge to protect the woman who had happily offered me up as collateral damage and stolen from my grandmother. But I was absolutely finished letting a spoiled, bigoted heiress speak to anyone in my bloodline like a stray dog. I stepped smoothly between the weeping Beatrice and the furious bride, forcing Chloe to take a rapid defensive step backward. I looked Chloe dead in the eye, stripping away the last remaining shred of her arrogant superiority. "Do not act high and mighty, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that carried directly to Richard Sterling, who was still standing frozen at the altar. "Do not stand there and pretend you are an untouchable victim in all of this." Chloe sneered, puffing out her chest to assert her inherited dominance. "I am a Sterling. You and your family are nothing." "You are collateral," I corrected her sharply. I turned my gaze from the bride to the billionaire patriarch. The color was rapidly draining from Richard's face as he realized exactly where this conversation was heading. "Did your father tell you the exact terms of that $15 million loan, Chloe?" I asked, projecting my voice so the remaining guests in the cathedral could hear every word. "Did he mention what he used to underwrite the wire transfer when Marcus's shell companies looked too risky on paper?" Chloe frowned, glancing back at Richard with a sudden flicker of uncertainty. "What is she talking about, Daddy?" I did not let Richard answer. I delivered the final crushing blow myself. "Your father knew Marcus was a massive risk, Chloe. He knew the ancestral land in Georgia was not enough to cover a $15 million cash transfer, so he legally tied the risk to the one asset he controls completely." I smiled, watching the absolute horror dawn in her eyes. "Did your father tell you that your personal trust fund was used as collateral for Marcus's offshore accounts?" Chloe froze. The vicious, hateful energy that had animated her entire body just a second ago evaporated, leaving behind nothing but cold, absolute terror. She slowly turned her head away from me and looked at her father. Richard Sterling, the ruthless billionaire, the man who crushed corporate rivals without breaking a sweat, could not meet his daughter's eyes. He looked down at the marble floor, his jaw tight, his silence serving as a deafening confirmation of my words. Chloe let out a sound that was half gasp, half scream. She realized in that exact moment that she had not just been humiliated by her fiancé, but actively sold out by her own flesh and blood. Her father had gambled her entire financial future, her personal safety net, on a man he knew was a massive liability simply to secure a real estate merger that did not even exist. She lunged toward Richard, her fists pounding against his chest. She screamed that he had ruined her life, that she was entirely penniless because of his unyielding greed, and that he had traded her future for a fraudulent business deal. Richard tried to grab her wrists, his face pale with shame and poorly concealed panic, but Chloe fought him off wildly, her designer veil tearing as she thrashed against him. The elite guests in the pews were watching a high society dynasty implode in real time. Before Richard could restrain his hysterical daughter, the massive, intricately carved oak doors at the very back of the sanctuary violently swung open. The heavy thud of the wood hitting the stone walls echoed sharply over the screaming bride. 4 men in dark, identical suits stepped into the vestibule. They wore grim professional expressions and carried the unmistakable heavy authority of the federal government. Gold badges flashed on their belts as they stepped in unison, beginning their synchronized march down the long white aisle. The remaining wedding guests physically recoiled. The venture capitalists, the socialites, and the politicians scrambled over the polished wooden pews to get out of their path, terrified of being caught in the crossfire of a federal raid. The atmosphere in the cathedral instantly shifted from a chaotic social scandal to a hard, terrifying, legal reality. Thomas Washington saw the federal agents approaching the altar and instantly snapped back into his lifelong delusion of grandeur. The man simply could not comprehend a world where his booming voice and manufactured community status did not command absolute obedience. He puffed out his chest violently, adjusting his tailored suit jacket, and marched directly into the center aisle to block the path of the approaching law enforcement officers. He raised his hands in a placating, authoritative gesture, wearing the same condescending smile he used to silence me when I was a child. "Officers, I am Deacon Washington, a pillar of this community," Thomas announced, his voice echoing with desperate, practiced piety. "This is a private family matter. There has been a terrible misunderstanding here today, and we will handle it internally. I must ask you to step outside and respect the sanctity of this church." The lead agent did not slow his pace. He did not blink. He did not even acknowledge Thomas as a human being worthy of a response. He simply reached to his tactical belt and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic clinking sound cut through the tense silence of the room. The agent walked right past Thomas, as if my father were entirely invisible, brushing his shoulder and leaving the great patriarch stammering to the empty air. Thomas spun around, his face pale with shock, his arms dropping limply to his sides as his ultimate authority was completely ignored. Everyone in the room turned their eyes to the altar. They fully expected the agents to tackle Marcus to the floor. Marcus was already sobbing, his hands raised in pathetic surrender, his knees shaking so badly he could barely stand. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the inevitable metal restraints to lock around his wrists, waiting to be dragged out of the cathedral in front of the cameras that were surely waiting outside. But the lead agent did not walk toward my brother. He bypassed the weeping groom entirely. He stepped smoothly around the shattered remnants of the floral archway, stepped over Chloe's discarded bridal bouquet, and walked directly up to the front pew. He stopped dead in front of my mother. Beatrice was still kneeling on the marble floor exactly where Chloe had kicked her away. She was clutching her designer purse to her chest, her face stained with ruined makeup, staring up at the federal agent with wide, uncomprehending eyes. "Beatrice Washington," the agent said, his voice ringing out with cold, clinical finality. "You are under arrest for conspiracy and wire fraud." The heavy steel cuffs snapped shut around Beatrice's wrists with a sharp, unforgiving metallic click. For a fraction of a second, the sheer impossibility of the situation seemed to short-circuit her brain. She stared down at the restraints, completely unable to process that the federal government was physically detaining her inside the very church she treated as her personal kingdom. Then the cold reality of the metal biting into her skin registered. Beatrice let out a scream so loud and so purely hysterical that it seemed to rattle the stained glass windows high above the altar. She thrashed against the federal agent, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face, her expensive silk dress twisting awkwardly around her knees as she desperately tried to pull her arms free. "Get your hands off me!" she shrieked, kicking wildly at the marble steps. "Thomas, do something! Tell them who we are!" The congregation erupted into a deafening chorus of gasps and outraged murmurs. The same elite society friends Beatrice had spent decades carefully curating and desperately trying to impress were now scrambling away from the front pews. They looked at her not with sympathy, but with the specific, highly contagious terror of people eager to avoid being associated with a federal indictment. Thomas did absolutely nothing. He took a stumbling, horrified step backward, physically distancing himself from his own wife. His chest heaved as he stared at the handcuffs, the full weight of his impending social and financial annihilation rendering him entirely mute. The deacon of the church, the man who demanded absolute submission from his household, could not find a single word of defense. Marcus remained completely paralyzed under the ruined floral archway. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes glassy and unblinking. He was watching his mother being violently dragged to her feet by federal law enforcement, and he could not force his body to move a single inch. The arrogant golden boy facade had entirely melted away, leaving behind a terrified little boy, incapable of facing the consequences of his own actions. The lead agent tightened his grip on Beatrice's arm, forcing her to stand still. He did not lower his voice to spare her dignity. He addressed her with the booming, absolute authority of a man reading a damning indictment into the public record. $15 million does not just disappear into thin air, Mrs. Washington. The agent stated, his voice echoing cleanly through the cavernous sanctuary. Your son could not funnel that kind of commercial capital into offshore gambling syndicates without a pristine, unquestionable financial conduit. The officiating pastor, who had been clutching his Bible in silent horror, suddenly turned a sickly shade of gray. He looked from the federal agent to Beatrice, a terrible dawning realization washing over his aged, weathered face. You are the esteemed treasurer of this cathedral, the agent continued, his tone dripping with professional disgust. For the last 18 months, you have been systematically laundering Marcus's stolen loan money directly through the church's tax-exempt charitable donation accounts. You disguised federal wire fraud as building fund allocations and orphanage outreach programs. The collective gasp that ripped through the sanctuary this time was born of pure, unadulterated revulsion. Stealing from a billionaire hedge fund was a corporate crime. Stealing from the church collection plates and orphaned children to cover a degenerate gambling addiction was a moral depravity that even the most ruthless venture capitalists in the room could not stomach. Chloe let out a sound of pure disgust, covering her mouth as if the very air around Beatrice was contaminated. Richard Sterling pulled his daughter behind him, physically shielding her from the spectacle, his face a mask of absolute legal calculation. The pastor physically swayed, gripping the wooden podium to keep from collapsing. He stared at the woman who had sat in the front row every Sunday, the woman who had led the prayer circles, and judged the congregation for their perceived sins. Beatrice, the pastor breathed out, his voice shaking with absolute heartbreak. You used the house of God to hide your theft. Beatrice's eyes darted frantically around the room. She looked at the disgusted faces of the country club wives. She looked at Richard Sterling, who was staring at her as if she were a disease. She looked at Thomas, the man she had obeyed and submitted to her entire life, who was now shaking his head and refusing to meet her gaze. The opulent, powerful world she had sacrificed my childhood to build was rejecting her completely. The federal agent began to read her Miranda rights, his partner stepping forward to take her other arm to escort her down the center aisle. The walk of shame she was about to endure would be broadcast to every news outlet in Atlanta before the hour was over. Panic, raw and absolute, finally broke her. I watched my mother, the woman who had repeatedly told me I was too aggressive, too ambitious, and too independent to ever be a proper Washington woman. She had preached the gospel of family loyalty every Sunday at this very altar. She had demanded I blindly sign over my grandmother's estate to save her precious son. And now, facing the terrifying reality of federal prison, her loyalty evaporated into thin air. The mother who had spent my entire life shielding her golden boy from the slightest inconvenience looked at Marcus. Her survival instinct violently kicked in, overriding decades of obsessive maternal devotion. It was him, Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking as she violently threw her head back and pointed a trembling handcuffed finger directly at Marcus. Marcus jolted as if he had been physically struck. He stared down at his mother in absolute betrayal, his eyes widening in pure horror. He made me do it! Beatrice sobbed hysterically, completely stripping away the last remaining shreds of her dignity as she actively sold her favorite child to the federal government. He told me the Sterling loan was delayed. He told me the offshore accounts were just temporary holds. He said if I did not help him clear the funds, we would lose the house. I only did what he told me to do. The entire cathedral gasped, as the ultimate matriarchal betrayal echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Marcus stared at his mother, his jaw unhinged, his mind completely unable to process what had just happened. The woman who had coddled him his entire life, the woman who had happily sacrificed my future to finance his delusions of grandeur, had just offered him up to the federal government on a silver platter. A second federal agent stepped up behind the paralyzed groom. He grabbed Marcus by the shoulders of his custom-tailored tuxedo, spun him around roughly, and wrenched his arms behind his back. The metallic snap of the handcuffs locking into place echoed sharply over the stunned silence of the congregation. Marcus let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. The golden child, the undisputed heir to the Washington family legacy, physically crumpled. His knees buckled, and the agent had to haul him upward by his biceps just to keep him standing. Sweat poured down his face, completely ruining his perfectly styled hair. He looked at Richard Sterling, whose face was twisted in absolute loathing. He looked at Chloe, who was backing away from him as if he were carrying a deadly plague. And then his panicked, desperate eyes locked onto me. The sociopathy that had driven his entire life kicked into high gear. If his mother could sacrifice him to save herself, he was fully prepared to do the exact same thing to me. "It is," Nia Marcus screamed, his voice cracking into a frantic, hysterical shriek. "It is Nia's fault. She is the financial expert. She is the one with the corporate background. She set up the shell companies." He strained against the federal agent's grip, twisting his body to point his cuffed hands in my direction. He was crying now, tears of pure cowardice streaming down his face. "I do not know anything about offshore accounts," Marcus sobbed, his voice echoing shrilly in the massive church. "Nia did all the wire transfers. Look at her. She is standing right there smiling because she framed us. She always hated me. She was jealous that I was marrying into the Sterling family. Arrest her. She orchestrated the whole thing to steal my inheritance." I stood perfectly still on the marble steps. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush to defend myself. I did not even flinch. I just let him dig his own grave deeper. It was a spectacular, horrifying display of his true nature. He was actively attempting to send his innocent sister to a federal penitentiary for decades, entirely willing to destroy my life, if it meant he could escape the consequences of his own staggering greed. The lead federal agent looked at Marcus with an expression of profound professional disgust. He did not entertain the frantic accusation for a single second. Instead, he reached inside the breast pocket of his dark suit and pulled out a thick, formally bound legal document. "That is a fascinating theory, Mr. Washington," the agent said, his tone dry and lethal. "However, the forensic accounting tells a vastly different story." The agent unfolded the heavy paper, the crisp rustling sound cutting through Marcus's pathetic sobbing. "I hold in my hand a sworn affidavit," the agent announced, projecting his voice so the remaining elite guests could hear every word of the Washington family's destruction. This affidavit is accompanied by 200 pages of corresponding bank records, secure IP logs, and offshore wire transfer receipts. This paper trail unequivocally clears your sister of any involvement in your fraudulent enterprises. Marcus shook his head wildly, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. "No, that is impossible. They are fake documents. You have to believe me." "The documents are entirely authentic," the agent interrupted sharply, stepping closer to the cuffed groom, "because they detail every single keystroke you made from your laptop inside the Sterling Estate guest house. They also detail every unauthorized transfer your mother made from the church's charitable accounts. You left a digital fingerprint on every single stolen dollar." But how Beatrice gasped from the floor, her voice a hollow, terrified rasp. No one else had access to those ledgers. "I secured the church accounts myself." The agent looked down at my kneeling mother. The documents were provided directly to the Criminal Investigation Division by an internal whistleblower, someone who had unrestricted backdoor access to your private accounting software. Someone who has been quietly and meticulously compiling this evidence for the past 6 months. The heavy oak doors at the back of the cathedral creaked open once again. Footsteps echoed loudly against the stone floors, distinct and unhurried. The rhythmic, confident clicking of high heels commanded the absolute attention of every person in the sanctuary. The sea of terrified venture capitalists and socialites parted instinctively, making way for the newcomer. I turned to look down the long white aisle, a genuine, fiercely satisfied smile finally breaking across my face. Actually, the lead agent said, gesturing toward the back of the church, the whistleblower who provided the paper trail clearing Nia and implicating both of you is right here. Walking down the center aisle of the most elite, pretentious cathedral in Atlanta was a woman who clearly did not belong in their sterile, high society world. And she did not care one bit. She wore a bright, unapologetically loud emerald green dress, massive gold hoop earrings, and a fiercely confident, unbothered expression. She walked with the kind of authentic swagger that could never be bought with a country club membership. Beatrice let out a choked, suffocating gasp. The last remaining color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. It was not just the fear of federal prison paralyzing her now. It was the absolute world-shattering shock of facing the living embodiment of her own elitist sins. It was Aunt Viv. This was the exact woman Beatrice had ruthlessly banished from the family 20 years ago. When my mother married Thomas and decided she wanted to climb the social ladder, she had cut her own sister out of the bloodline. Beatrice had claimed Viv was too ghetto, too loud, and too unrefined to ever associate with the prestigious Washington name. My mother had literally erased her own sister from existence to protect her precious manufactured image. Aunt Viv walked directly up to the altar, stopping just a few feet away from where Beatrice was kneeling in her handcuffs. Viv did not look intimidated by the federal agents or the billionaire Sterling family watching from the pews. She looked Beatrice up and down slowly, taking in the ruined designer silk dress, the smeared makeup, and the heavy steel restraints locking her wrists together. "Hello, B," Aunt Viv said, her voice rich and dripping with pure, unadulterated satisfaction. "I hear you have been having some trouble with your accounting." Beatrice let out a sound that was barely human, a strangled, guttural gasp that sounded like she was physically choking on the air inside the cathedral. The heavy silver handcuffs clinked together as she instinctively tried to raise her hands to cover her face, desperate to hide from the woman standing before her. Aunt Viv did not blink. She stood tall, radiant, and completely unapologetic in her emerald green dress, her presence absorbing all the oxygen in the room. For 20 years, Beatrice had painted Viv as a cautionary tale. My mother had told everyone in her elite circles that her sister was a lazy, uneducated embarrassment who had squandered her potential and vanished into the gutter. Beatrice had used Viv's supposed failure as a weapon to keep me in line, threatening me with the exact same fate if I ever dared to step out of her shadow. But the woman standing at the altar was no cautionary tale. Viv radiated a quiet, lethal power. She looked at my mother, who was currently weeping on her knees in a ruined designer gown, surrounded by federal agents, and offered a smile that was absolutely devastating in its calmness. "You told everyone I was dead," Viv said, her voice projecting effortlessly through the dead silent church. "You told your country club friends that I was a drug addict. You told the pastor I was a lost cause who ran away. But we both know exactly why I disappeared, do we not?" Beatrice Thomas finally found his voice. His face was purple with rage and humiliation. He lunged forward, pointing a trembling finger at Viv. "Get her out of here," Thomas bellowed, looking frantically at the federal agents. "This woman is a trespasser. She is a liar and a vagrant. Remove her from this sanctuary immediately." The lead federal agent did not even look at my father. He simply stepped between Thomas and Viv, placing his hand heavily on his weapon in a clear, unspoken warning. Thomas froze, his patriarchal authority crumbling into dust. Viv turned her gaze to Thomas, her eyes narrowing with absolute disgust. "Shut your mouth, Thomas." Viv snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. "You are not intimidating anyone today. You are just the coward who helped my sister steal everything I owned." A fresh wave of shock rippled through the pews. Richard Sterling leaned forward, his corporate instincts suddenly recognizing the sheer magnitude of the fraud that was unraveling before him. The wealthy congregation murmured in absolute horror, realizing the foundation of the Washington family empire was entirely fabricated. Viv turned back to Beatrice, refusing to let my mother look away. "You did not build your perfect high society life on hard work," Viv stated, each word dropping like an anvil. "You built it on my blood. 20 years ago, when our father died, you and Thomas forged the executor documents. You legally locked me out of the family accounts and drained my entire half of the inheritance. You took the money meant for my college education, the money meant for my future, and you used it to buy that obnoxious 10-bedroom mansion in Buckhead." Beatrice squeezed her eyes shut, sobbing hysterically, shaking her head in a pathetic attempt to deny the truth. "You threw me out onto the street with absolutely nothing." Viv continued, her voice rising with righteous, undeniable anger. "You banished me because I was too loud, too ghetto, and too poor to fit into the pristine, fake reality you were desperately trying to construct. You erased me so you could play the perfect socialite." Viv paused, taking a slow, deliberate breath. The cathedral was so quiet you could hear the soft rustle of Chloe Sterling's torn wedding veil. "But you made one fatal miscalculation," Viv said, her gaze shifting from Beatrice to me. A warm, fiercely proud smile crossed her face. "You forgot that your daughter is exactly like me." Marcus, still restrained by the second agent, let out a confused, wet sob. He looked frantically between me and Viv, his mind completely unable to process the alliance that had just destroyed his life. "Nia found me 5 years ago," Viv announced to the entire room. "While you were busy punishing her for being too independent, while you were screaming at her for not serving Marcus, like a maid, she was using her corporate salary to keep me off the streets. Nia paid for my apartment. She paid for my advanced forensic accounting certifications. She bought the software I needed to track your dirty money." Beatrice opened her eyes, staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. Her brain was finally connecting the dots. The independent daughter she had relentlessly abused and the sister she had ruthlessly discarded had been working together in the shadows for half a decade. "We did not just stumble onto your church laundering scheme," Viv said, tapping the side of her head. "I was the one who flagged the initial discrepancies in the church donations. I handed the encrypted files to Naya, and she organized the corporate data packet that we handed directly to the IRS. We built the cage, and you and Marcus happily locked yourselves inside it. It was a masterclass in strategic vengeance. I had not just refused to be their sacrificial lamb, I had actively funded the architect of their destruction. I stood tall on the altar, feeling the crushing weight of 20 years of familial abuse finally lifting off my shoulders. I looked at Beatrice and Marcus, feeling absolutely no pity for the people who had tried to ruin my life. Beatrice slumped forward, her forehead nearly touching the cold marble floor. The realization that she had financed her own luxurious life with stolen money only to lose it all because of the very people she had oppressed completely shattered her mind. She scrambled for a lifeline, her desperate brain latching on to the only asset she thought was safe. "You have nothing," Beatrice whispered, her voice a broken, raspy plea. "The government will take the house. They will take the church accounts. But the family trust, the Washington ancestral land in Georgia, we still have that. Marcus is the sole heir. You cannot touch the land." Viv let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed brightly through the heavy atmosphere of the cathedral. She reached into the deep pocket of her emerald dress. The federal agents watched her closely, but made no move to stop her. Viv pulled out a thick, weathered, leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked and peeling with age, secured by a tarnished brass clasp. Beatrice saw the journal and physically stopped breathing. Her eyes bugged out of her head and all the blood rushed from her face. "You see," Viv said, holding the worn leather book high in the air for everyone to see. "When you and Thomas were busy forging the bank documents 20 years ago to steal the cash, you assumed I had already turned over everything from the estate. You assumed you had completely wiped me out." Viv took a slow, deliberate step closer to my handcuffed mother. "You forgot that I was the one holding Big Mama's true, unedited will." Thomas took a panicked, stumbling step toward the altar, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. He raised his hand, pointing a trembling finger at Viv, his booming patriarchal voice cracking into a desperate screech. Thomas took a panicked, stumbling step toward the altar, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. He raised his hand, pointing a trembling finger at Viv, his booming patriarchal voice cracking into a desperate screech. He demanded the federal agents arrest Viv for forgery, claiming the book was a fake, a desperate fabrication created by a jealous outcast who wanted to ruin their flawless reputation. Viv did not even dignify his outburst with a response. She simply stepped around my father as if he were a piece of discarded trash. She walked directly up to the trembling pastor. The elderly man was still gripping his podium, sweat beading on his forehead, as his entire congregation watched the spectacle unfold. Viv slammed the heavy leather-bound journal down right on top of his open Bible. "Read it," Viv commanded, her voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. "Read the entry dated October 4th, exactly 3 days before my mother passed away. Read it directly into that microphone so every single person in this sanctuary understands exactly who they have been sitting next to all these years." The pastor looked down at the journal, his hands shaking so badly that the brass clasp rattled against the wood of the podium. He looked at Beatrice, who was violently shaking her head, silently begging him to stop. Then he looked at the federal agents who were watching him with cold, expectant stares, silently daring him to obstruct a federal investigation. With a trembling sigh, the pastor adjusted his reading glasses, leaned into the microphone, and began to read the crisp, undeniable handwriting of the woman who had founded the Washington family legacy. "I, Martha Washington, being of entirely sound mind and absolutely no patience for the greed infecting my bloodline, write this as my final and binding testament." The pastor read, his voice echoing loudly through the cathedral speakers. "For years I have watched my daughter Beatrice and her husband Thomas operate like financial parasites. I have watched them drain the resources of this family, treating my hard-earned legacy as their personal piggy bank to buy their way into social circles that despise them." A collective gasp rippled through the pews. Richard Sterling physically recoiled, his face a mask of pure revulsion as he looked at the family he had almost bound his daughter to. Chloe was sobbing into her hands, completely mortified, realizing she had nearly married into a family of absolute frauds. The pastor swallowed hard, wiping sweat from his brow before continuing. "They assume I am blind to their theft because my body is failing, but my mind remains sharper than their hollow ambitions. As I write this, I am confined to my deathbed. My breathing is shallow and my time is short. And yet the only person holding my hand is my granddaughter Naya." My chest tightened as the pastor spoke the words. I remembered that night with agonizing clarity. I remembered the sterile smell of the hospice room, the steady heartbreaking beep of the heart monitor, and the crushing weight of sitting alone in the dark, while my grandmother slowly slipped away from me. I had held her frail hand for 3 days straight, refusing to leave her side for even a moment. "Beatrice Thomas and my golden grandson Marcus are not here." The pastor read, his voice gaining a sudden righteous strength. "They are currently attending the annual Founders Gala at the Oak Ridge Country Club. They deemed rubbing elbows with wealthy strangers more important than sitting with the woman who gave them everything. They left me to die alone so they could drink champagne and pretend to be royalty. Therefore, I am legally severing them from my estate." The silence in the cathedral was absolute and heavy. The horrifying reality of my family's sociopathy was laid bare for the entire world to see. They had not just stolen money, they had completely abandoned the matriarch of their family in her final agonizing hours just to maintain their fake elite social status. Even the federal agents looked disgusted, tightening their grips on Beatrice and Marcus. Marcus dropped his head, sobbing loudly, his handcuffed wrists straining against his back. Thomas collapsed into the front pew, burying his face in his hands, as his entire community realized he was a monster. Beatrice had stopped struggling. She hung limply in the agent's grasp, her eyes wide and vacant, completely destroyed by the public exposure of her ultimate sin. "I leave absolutely nothing to Beatrice Thomas or Marcus." The pastor continued, his voice ringing with finality. "Every asset, every account, and the entirety of the Washington ancestral estate belongs solely to Nia. She is the only one who possesses the integrity to carry our name." Viv looked at me, a fierce protective pride shining in her eyes. I stood tall on the marble steps, feeling the ghosts of my past finally release their grip on my future. I had spent my entire life being told I was the defective child, the failure who would never measure up to Marcus. But Big Mama had seen the truth. She had known exactly who I was, and she had armed me with the power to tear down the fraudulent empire my parents had built. But the pastor was not finished. He frowned, squinting at the bottom of the page, his brow furrowing in confusion. "There is one final line," the pastor said, his voice dropping into a hesitant, bewildered tone. Viv smirked, crossing her arms over her emerald green dress. She looked directly at Beatrice, watching the last drop of hope drain from my mother's eyes. "Read it, Pastor. Read the whole thing." The pastor leaned closer to the microphone. The final words echoed ominously through the massive sanctuary, sending a sudden sharp chill straight down my spine. "To Nia, I leave the house," the pastor read slowly, deliberately, articulating every single syllable. "And the true legacy, hidden behind the false walls of the basement." The echo of the pastor's words faded into a heavy, suffocating silence. Richard Sterling moved. The billionaire venture capitalist possessed the predatory instincts of a great white shark, and the pastor had just spilled fresh blood into the water. The words "true legacy" and "hidden" triggered an immediate, visceral reaction in the patriarch of the Sterling Empire. He did not care about the emotional destruction of the Washington family. He only cared about his bottom line. Sterling stepped out of the front pew, his expensive leather shoes cracking sharply against the marble floor. He physically blocked the center aisle, holding up a hand, adorned with a custom platinum watch, to halt the federal agents who were currently dragging Marcus toward the exit. "Wait just a damn minute," Sterling barked, his voice carrying the absolute, unquestionable authority of a man accustomed to buying governments. "Nobody is leaving this cathedral until we clarify the ownership of those assets." The lead federal agent stopped, his hand tightening on Marcus's shoulder. He looked at the billionaire with a mixture of annoyance and professional caution. "This is an active federal arrest, Mr. Sterling. Move aside." "I will do no such thing," Sterling fired back, standing his ground. "That sniveling coward you have in handcuffs just defaulted on $15 million in bridge loans that were financed directly by my holding company. And the collateral he used to secure that specific line of credit was the deed to the Washington family estate." Sterling pointed a rigid finger at the pastor, who was still clutching Big Mama's true will. "If there is a hidden vault inside that property," Sterling declared, his eyes flashing with raw, unfiltered greed, "then it belongs to me. I hold the primary lien on the house. That means whatever true legacy is buried behind those basement walls is legally the property of Sterling Enterprises. I am seizing those assets to cover the fraud your groom just committed against my family." Marcus jolted at the sound of Sterling's voice. The sheer terror of federal prison had completely stripped away his arrogant facade, leaving only a desperate, groveling shell of a man. Hearing Sterling lay claim to the hidden wealth, Marcus saw a pathetic, momentary lifeline. He violently twisted his body, fighting against the heavy steel cuffs, digging into his wrists, and threw himself toward his former prospective father-in-law. The federal agent had to physically yank him backward to keep him from collapsing at Sterling's feet. "I will give it to you, Richard!" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking into a hysterical, high-pitched shriek. The entire congregation watched in absolute disgust as the golden boy of the Washington family actively tried to sell out his own grandmother's final secret. "I will sign it all over to you right now," Marcus sobbed, sweat and tears ruining the collar of his custom tuxedo. "Whatever is in that basement, whatever Big Mama hid down there, you can have every single penny of it. Just post my bail. Please, Richard. Use the hidden money to cover the loans and post my bail. Tell these agents you are dropping the charges. I will give you everything in the basement." Beatrice, still kneeling on the floor in her own handcuffs, let out a wretched, horrified wail. She realized in real time that her precious favored son was entirely willing to trade the last remaining shred of their family wealth just to save his own skin. Thomas stared at Marcus with a blank, shattered expression, finally seeing the monster he had spent decades creating and enabling. I watched this spectacular display of cowardice from the altar. The absolute predictability of their greed was almost poetic. They were fighting over scraps of a ghost story, ready to tear each other apart for a treasure they had not even seen. I broke the heavy, tense silence of the cathedral with a laugh. It was not a warm sound. It was a cold, echoing laugh that sliced cleanly through Marcus's pathetic sobbing and Richard Sterling's aggressive posturing. Every head in the sanctuary snapped toward me. I slowly walked down the marble steps, my posture perfectly straight, my expression completely unbothered. I looked at the billionaire who thought he owned my family, and then I looked at the brother who had tried to destroy my life. "You cannot give him what is not there, Marcus," I stated, my voice projecting with crystal clear precision. Marcus froze, his mouth hanging open in dumbfounded confusion. Sterling narrowed his eyes, his corporate instincts suddenly warning him that a massive trap had just been sprung. "I emptied the basement vault 6 months ago," I revealed, watching the color drain entirely from Marcus's face. The collective gasp from the elite congregation was deafening. Beatrice physically slumped against the wooden leg of the front pew, her mind completely short-circuiting. She and Thomas had lived in that house for decades. They had scoured every inch of the property looking for Big Mama's hidden cash reserves, and they had slept directly above it the entire time, completely oblivious. "You really thought Big Mama would leave her actual wealth sitting around for you to steal?" I asked, staring directly at my mother. "While you and Thomas were busy sipping champagne at the Oak Ridge Country Club gala, while you were abandoning her in a hospice room to die alone, she gave me the blueprints to the estate. She told me exactly which stone panels in the wine cellar to remove." I turned my attention back to Richard Sterling, whose face was rapidly turning purple with rage. "There were no gold bars or fancy jewelry down there, Mr. Sterling," I explained, enjoying the sheer panic radiating from the billionaire. "Big Mama was much smarter than that. She hid original bearer bonds, untraceable vintage lockbox keys, and the original unencumbered deeds to 3 commercial properties in downtown Atlanta. Assets she had quietly legally transferred into a blind trust solely in my name 10 years ago." Sterling clenched his fists, realizing his ironclad collateral was rapidly turning to dust. "And do you know what I did with all that untraceable wealth?" I asked, my gaze shifting to Marcus, who was now shaking uncontrollably. "I did not buy sports cars. I did not buy designer watches. I used Big Mama's true legacy to fund my own. I used it to pay for Aunt Viv's life when my mother threw her out on the street. And I used it to hire the most ruthless, thorough, and aggressive forensic accounting firm on the East Coast." I took a final step toward my handcuffed brother. "Your grandmother's hidden money paid for the exact audit that just put you in federal handcuffs, Marcus. I liquidated the vault to buy your destruction. So no, you cannot offer Mr. Sterling the contents of the basement. The vault is completely empty. And because you used a property that is currently the subject of a federal RICO investigation as collateral, the government is going to seize the house anyway." I smiled at Richard Sterling, whose entire corporate empire was about to take a $15 million loss. "Your collateral is absolutely worthless, Richard. You own nothing, and Marcus has nothing left to sell." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and suffocating. Richard Sterling stood perfectly still, his eyes darting between me, the federal agents, and the pathetic, sniveling mess that was Marcus. The reality of his colossal financial blunder was visibly sinking in. He had lent $15 million to a degenerate gambler based on a fraudulent deed, and now the federal government was about to seize the very dirt that house was built on. But Sterling was not a man who accepted total defeat. His mind, trained by decades of ruthless corporate acquisitions, latched onto the one loose thread in my revelation. "If the vault is empty," Sterling demanded, his voice dangerously low, "what exactly did you take out of it? A few bearer bonds and some downtown property deeds do not require a false wall in a basement. What was the true legacy?" Beatrice jerked her head up, her tear-streaked face twisting in sudden desperate curiosity. Even now, facing federal prison, her insatiable greed overrode her terror. Thomas stopped rubbing his face and stared at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. They had lived in that house for 30 years. They had stomped across those basement floorboards every single day, completely oblivious to the wealth beneath their feet. Big Mama was not just a quiet woman who sat in the front pew of this church. I began letting my voice carry through the cavernous sanctuary. She was a visionary. During the height of the civil rights movement, while the rest of the world was burning, she was quietly acting as a patron of the arts. She provided a safe haven for Black artists who were being targeted, silenced, or exploited by gallery owners who wanted to steal their work. Aunt Viv nodded slowly from the altar, a proud, fierce smile on her lips. She knew the secret, and she had guarded it with her life. When those artists needed to protect their masterpieces, I continued, they did not trust banks. They did not trust institutions. They trusted Big Mama. They gave their life's work to her for safekeeping. And she built that false wall to ensure no one, especially not her own greedy daughter, would ever get their hands on it. Beatrice let out a sharp, offended gasp, the steel cuffs clinking as she pressed her hands to her chest. "Those paintings were in my house," she shrieked, her voice echoing wildly. "They belong to me. I am her daughter. They are my birthright. They were never yours." "B," Aunt Viv snapped, looking down at my mother with absolute pity. "You would have sold them at a pawn shop for a fraction of their worth just to buy another pair of designer shoes. You do not appreciate art, you only appreciate price tags." I turned back to Richard Sterling, whose corporate mask was beginning to slip, replaced by a hungry, predatory intensity. "There were over 40 original undocumented canvases hidden down there," I revealed. "Masterpieces from the Harlem Renaissance. Unseen works by Aaron Douglas, Jacob Lawrence, and Augusta Savage. They had been perfectly preserved in oilcloth and sealed in climate-resistant crates since the 1960s. It was a literal time capsule of American history buried right under my parents' feet." Marcus let out a guttural groan, his head falling back against the chest of the federal agent holding him. He had stolen $15 million from a billionaire, destroyed his entire family, and ruined his life, all while sleeping directly above an art collection of unprecedented historical significance. "It took me 6 months to safely extract them," I explained, keeping my gaze locked on Sterling. "I used my corporate credentials and my expertise as an art authenticator to quietly move the entire collection. I hired a team of elite, discreet restoration specialists to ensure the canvases were pristine. They are currently sitting in a state-of-the-art, maximum security, climate-controlled vault in Switzerland, completely untouchable by the federal government, completely untouchable by my parents, and completely untouchable by you." The pastor gripped his podium, his eyes wide behind his spectacles. The elite guests remaining in the pews were practically vibrating with shock. This was no longer just a scandal about embezzlement. It was the unveiling of one of the greatest lost art collections in modern history. Richard Sterling took a slow, deliberate step toward me. The anger over his lost $15 million seemed to instantly evaporate, replaced by a feverish, calculating obsession. He was an art collector. He understood exactly what an undocumented collection of that magnitude meant to the global market. The sheer exclusivity of it made his mouth water. "Nia," Sterling said, his tone suddenly shifting from hostile to aggressively negotiating. "Let us be reasonable here. We are both professionals. We understand the complexities of the secondary art market. You are going to need a broker to move those pieces. You are going to need capital to properly exhibit them. I have the infrastructure. I have the network. We can partner on this. We can forget about Marcus and the bridge loans entirely." He stepped even closer, his eyes practically glowing with unadulterated greed. He had completely abandoned his daughter Chloe, who was standing a few feet away, weeping in her ruined wedding dress. Sterling only saw the ultimate acquisition. "Just tell me one thing," Sterling breathed, his voice trembling with anticipation. "What is the appraised value of that collection?" I stood perfectly still on the marble steps of the altar. I looked at Marcus, who was weeping in federal handcuffs. I looked at Beatrice, who was completely broken on the floor. I looked at Thomas, whose entire world had collapsed. And then I looked Richard Sterling, dead in the eye. $1.2 billion, I stated, my voice echoing like a gavel striking wood. And it is fully protected under an irrevocable trust in my name. The silence that followed that number was not just quiet. It was a complete absence of sound, a vacuum created by the sheer incomprehensible magnitude of $1.2 billion. Richard Sterling, a man who built his entire identity on financial supremacy, took a physical step backward. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The absolute finality of the irrevocable trust meant he had zero legal leverage. I had outmaneuvered a titan of industry without breaking a single drop of sweat. But the most disturbing reaction did not come from the billionaire. It came from the people who shared my DNA. The psychological whiplash was so violent and instantaneous that it was genuinely terrifying to witness. Beatrice, who just moments ago was wailing on the floor and trying to avoid federal prison, suddenly stopped crying. Her tears of terror vanished, replaced instantly by a manic, feverish glow. The absolute dread of a federal indictment was completely wiped away by the intoxicating allure of $1 billion. She strained against the federal agents holding her arms, ignoring the metal cuffs biting into her wrists. She threw her head back and looked at me, not with the hatred she had harbored for 30 years, but with a sickening, manufactured adoration. "Oh, Nia," Beatrice wept, her voice trembling with a forced syrupy warmth that made my stomach churn. "My beautiful, gifted daughter." A collective shudder went through the remaining congregation. The sheer audacity of her pivot was breathtaking. Thomas, taking his wife's cue, immediately straightened his ruined posture. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked up at me with a proud, patriarchal smile that was so fake it looked like a mask stitched onto his face. "We knew you had it in you, Nia," Thomas boomed, attempting to summon his old deacon voice as if he were not currently facing total financial ruin. "We always knew you were the smart one, the one with the real vision. You saved the Washington legacy." Marcus, still pinned by the agent, let out a confused, wet gasp. He looked at his parents, completely bewildered that they were instantly abandoning him to grovel at the feet of the sister they had all despised. Beatrice actually tried to lunge forward, fighting the agents to close the distance between us. She wanted to embrace me. She wanted to wrap her handcuffed arms around the daughter she had emotionally tortured for 3 decades. "We knew you were special," Beatrice cried out, projecting her voice for the entire church to hear, desperately trying to rewrite history in real time. "We had to be hard on you, sweetheart. Do you not see it now? We were just testing you to make you strong. We pushed you so you could become this incredible woman. You are our greatest pride, Nia. Please tell these agents to let us go. You have the money to fix all of this." I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. The absolute unadulterated narcissistic delusion required to claim my abuse was actually a calculated parenting strategy was staggering. I physically stepped backward on the marble altar, entirely disgusted by the display. The federal agents looked at my parents with raw revulsion, tightening their grips to prevent Beatrice from moving another inch. "You truly are sick," I stated, my voice echoing coldly across the sanctuary. "You will rewrite any reality, sell any child, and tell any lie just to survive." "But Nia, we are family," Thomas pleaded, stepping toward the aisle before a third agent blocked his path. "You cannot let your own blood go to prison when you have the power to save us. We are the Washingtons." I did not argue with him. I did not scream or lose my composure. Instead, I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my smartphone. During the months I spent funding Aunt Viv and orchestrating the forensic audit, I had also taken the liberty of thoroughly upgrading the security network in the Washington estate. That included installing highly sensitive, undetectable audio recorders in the spaces where my parents felt the most secure. I tapped the screen of my phone, seamlessly connecting my device to the cathedral's state-of-the-art Bluetooth sound system. "Testing me?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet. "Let us hear how you tested me last Tuesday." I pressed play. A sharp click echoed through the massive speakers, followed immediately by the crisp, undeniable audio of my father's voice. The recording was so clear, it sounded like Thomas was standing directly next to the microphone. It is the only way B. Thomas's recorded voice resonated through the church. "The Sterling loans are coming due, and Marcus has gambled away the bridge funds. If Nia will not willingly sign over her corporate accounts to save her brother, we have to force her hand." The real Thomas froze in the aisle, the fake proud smile instantly melting off his face as the blood drained from his cheeks. Beatrice gasped, her eyes darting frantically toward the speakers mounted high on the stone pillars. Then my mother's voice filled the sanctuary, laced with venom and cold calculation. I already spoke to Dr. Aris. The recorded. Beatrice replied smoothly. He said for $50,000 he will write the psychiatric evaluation himself. He will state that Nia is suffering from severe delusions, bipolar mania, and is a danger to herself. With his medical credentials, the judge will sign the involuntary commitment order the same day. A wave of pure horror washed over the congregation. Chloe Sterling covered her mouth, backing away from the altar, as if the entire Washington family were radioactive. The federal agents exchanged dark, knowing glances, their grips on my parents turning punishingly tight. We lock her in a private facility for a few months, the recorded. Thomas continued, his tone entirely casual, as he discussed destroying my freedom. The court grants us full conservatorship over her estate and assets due to her mental incompetence. We liquidate her stock portfolios, cover Marcus's debts, and she stays locked away until she learns to respect her family. It is flawless. The recording clicked off, leaving the cathedral submerged in a deafening, toxic silence. I looked down at my parents. Their psychological whiplash was complete. The desperate fawning adoration had vanished, replaced by the sheer naked terror of knowing their ultimate, unforgivable betrayal had just been broadcast to the federal government, high society, and God himself. The final echoing syllable of my mother's recorded voice hung in the vaulted ceiling of the cathedral like a toxic cloud. For a long, suffocating moment, the massive sanctuary was completely devoid of sound. The sheer predatory malice of their plot to lock their own daughter in a psychiatric ward for profit was too massive, too profoundly evil for anyone to process instantly. Even the federal agents, men who dealt with high-level corporate fraud and organized crime on a daily basis, seemed momentarily frozen by the chilling casual nature of the betrayal. Then the collective revulsion broke. It started with a low, unified murmur that rapidly escalated into a chaotic symphony of disgusted whispers and scraping wood as hundreds of people stood up simultaneously. The elite society my parents had worshipped, the wealthy socialites they had bankrupted themselves to impress, were standing up in mass and turning their backs. Women in designer hats and men in tailored suits shoved past each other to reach the massive oak doors. They were fleeing, practically running, to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Washington family. Beatrice reached a trembling hand out, her manicured fingers grasping at the empty air, as her lifelong friends, the women she played tennis and drank mimosas with, averted their eyes and hurried past her without a single word of comfort. Down at the front of the aisle, Chloe Sterling stood trembling. Her flawless custom-designed wedding gown suddenly looked less like a bridal dress and more like a tragic, ridiculous costume. She stared at the man she had almost pledged her life to. Marcus was still pinned by the federal agent, weeping softly, his perfectly styled hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. But Chloe did not cry. She did not collapse into a puddle of grief or seek comfort from her father. Instead, her face hardened into a mask of pure glacial contempt. She looked at Marcus not with heartbreak, but with the cold, sharp realization that she had almost bound herself to a parasitic sociopath who was willing to destroy his own sister for a payout. She reached down to her left hand, her fingers violently gripping the massive, flawless diamond ring Marcus had given her. It was a ring purchased with stolen money, secured by a fraudulent legacy, and presented to her on a foundation of absolute lies. With a sharp, furious yank, she tore it off her finger. She did not hand it back. She did not place it gently on the pew. She stepped forward, her eyes blazing with unfiltered fury, and threw it as hard as she physically could directly into Marcus's face. The heavy platinum setting struck his cheekbone with a sickening, audible crack. Marcus recoiled with a yelp of pain, his head snapping to the side. A bright line of crimson blood instantly welled up, slicing a jagged, ugly path down his skin and dripping onto the crisp white collar of his ruined tuxedo. The diamond ring hit the marble floor and bounced away into the shadows, forgotten and worthless in the grand scheme of his total destruction. Richard Sterling did not even flinch at his daughter's sudden display of violence. He simply placed a protective, heavy hand on Chloe's shoulder, steering her toward the center aisle to join the mass exodus of the congregation, but he paused just long enough to look down at the bleeding, pathetic mess of a man who had tried to con the Sterling Empire. Richard leaned in close, his voice vibrating with a cold, terrifying certainty that easily cut through the noise of the retreating crowd. "You crossed the wrong family, boy." Sterling stated his words, hitting Marcus like physical blows. "By the time my corporate lawyers and these federal agents are done with you, you will not have a single dime to your name. You are going to spend the rest of your life rotting in a federal cell, and I am going to make sure they bury the key." Richard turned on his heel, his expensive leather shoes echoing against the marble floor with absolute finality, and led his daughter out of the cathedral without ever looking back. Marcus watched his entire future walk out those heavy oak doors. He watched the beautiful bride, who was supposed to legitimize him, disappear. He watched the billionaire father-in-law, who was supposed to blindly fund his lavish lifestyle, vanish. He watched the elite society that was supposed to worship him abandon him in utter disgust. All of it was gone. The carefully constructed golden facade of his life had been vaporized in a matter of minutes, leaving him with absolutely nothing but handcuffs and a looming prison sentence. The federal agents shifted their grips, securing his restraints and preparing to drag him out of the church and into a waiting transport vehicle. But the absolute loss of his money, his freedom, and his cherished status as the untouchable golden child triggered something dark and primal inside him. The groveling, weeping cowardice vanished. It was instantly replaced by a sudden, blinding, psychotic rage. He had nothing left to lose, and in his twisted, deeply entitled mind, I was the sole reason his perfect empire had fallen. With a sudden explosive burst of adrenaline that caught the federal agents completely off guard, Marcus twisted his body violently. He slammed his elbow backward, driving it hard into the jaw of the primary agent. The man grunted, stumbling backward as his grip broke just long enough for Marcus to wrench his body free. Marcus stumbled toward the altar, his eyes wild, feral, and completely unhinged. The blood pouring from his cheek gave him a horrifying, manic appearance. Marcus Thomas screamed from the floor, his voice cracking in raw terror. "Stop!" But Marcus was entirely beyond reason. His mind had completely snapped. He lunged toward the heavy carved oak communion table positioned just below the altar. His cuffed hands reached out clumsily but fiercely, grabbing the base of a massive solid brass candlestick. With a guttural snarl, he ripped it into the air, tearing it away from the floral arrangements and sending wax tumbling to the floor. The thick metal was heavy and undeniably lethal. He turned his bloodshot, murderous eyes directly on me. He let out a primal, deafening roar that shook the very walls of the sanctuary and charged up the marble steps, swinging the heavy brass weapon straight at my head with absolute murderous intent. The trajectory of this brass candlestick caught the light streaming through the stained glass, a heavy, lethal blur aimed directly at my skull. I did not blink. I did not take a single step backward. I had spent my entire life cowering from Marcus's tantrums, shrinking myself to accommodate his unchecked rage and explosive violence. For 30 years, my parents had demanded I absorb his abuse to maintain the illusion of family peace. Today, I was an immovable object. Before Marcus could cross the final 3 feet separating us, 2 massive figures materialized from the shadows of the choir loft. The private security contractors I had quietly positioned before the ceremony moved with terrifying coordinated precision. They did not just intercept my brother, they completely dismantled his momentum. The first guard caught Marcus squarely in the chest, wrapping thick arms around his torso and lifting him entirely off his feet. The second guard swept his legs with brutal efficiency. The sickening hollow thud of Marcus's body slamming against the unforgiving marble altar echoed loudly through the cavernous sanctuary. The heavy brass candlestick slipped from his grasp, clattering uselessly down the stone steps and rolling away into the shadows. Marcus did not try to fight back. The instant the breath was violently knocked from his lungs and the cold stone pressed against his cheek, the last remaining illusion of his superiority shattered into a million pieces. The federal agents immediately swarmed him, dragging his arms behind his back and tightening the steel cuffs. Marcus curled his body inward, pulling his knees toward his chest, and began to wail. It was not the angry, defiant shout of a thwarted mastermind. It was the high-pitched, hyperventilating, uncontrollable sobbing of a spoiled, terrified child who had finally been told no. The sound of her precious golden son being brutally neutralized and dragged across the floor was the final devastating blow for Beatrice. She let out a horrific, guttural shriek, her knees giving out completely as she collapsed onto the hard floor. The sudden, violent movement knocked her meticulously styled, incredibly expensive lace front wig entirely askew. It slid sideways across her forehead, exposing the thinning gray, unkempt edges she had spent thousands of dollars a month desperately trying to hide. "Help us!" Beatrice wailed, her voice cracking as she extended her handcuffed arms toward the center aisle. "Please, somebody help us. We are the Washingtons." But the sanctuary was a ghost town. The elite society she had worshipped, the billionaires and socialites she had lied and stolen to impress, were completely gone. The massive wooden pews were empty. She was performing her ultimate tragedy to a room full of vacant seats and cold statues. In the second pew, Thomas finally broke. The imposing patriarch of the Washington family, the man who had ruled his household with an iron fist. A booming voice and a heart of absolute stone let out a sharp, ragged gasp. He clutched his chest, his fingers digging into the expensive fabric of his suit jacket. His face turned an alarming, sickly shade of ash gray. He stumbled sideways, collapsing heavily against the wooden armrest, hyperventilating as a severe panic attack seized his entire body. His eyes were wide with a suffocating, inescapable terror. The empire he built on fraud, theft, and the psychological torture of his own daughter had physically crushed him. I stepped smoothly over the discarded brass candlestick, my heels clicking methodically against the stone. The absolute chaos surrounding me felt entirely distant, like a movie playing on a muted television screen. I walked directly up to the lead federal agent who was currently hauling Marcus to his feet by the collar of his ruined tuxedo. I caught the agent's eye and reached into the inner pocket of my blazer one last time. I pulled out a small encrypted black flash drive and pressed it firmly into his waiting palm. "This contains the offshore account passwords," I stated, my voice ringing with a cold, absolute finality. "It holds the routing numbers, the digital signatures, and the exact paper trail connecting them to every single dollar of the embezzled funds. Make sure they do not get a dime for bail." The federal agent looked down at the flash drive, his expression shifting into a mask of deep professional respect. He closed his fingers tightly around the device and gave me a single definitive nod. "We will take it from here, Ms. Washington." I turned around. I looked down from the altar at the twisted, broken remnants of the people who were supposed to love me. Marcus was being dragged through the side doors by federal agents, screaming my name in a final, pathetic, high-pitched plea. Thomas was gasping for air on the floor of the pew, completely paralyzed by the realization that his life was over. Beatrice was weeping into the cold marble, a disheveled, disgraced fraud, crying out to a society that had already erased her from their memory. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel a single shred of regret. I simply felt entirely beautifully free. I turned my back on my family forever. I walked down the center aisle, my head held high, my posture perfectly aligned, feeling the ghosts of my past finally release their grip on my soul. The heavy oak doors at the back of the cathedral had been thrown wide open by the fleeing crowd, framing a massive glowing rectangle of brilliant afternoon sunlight. I walked straight out of the shadows and stepped into the light. The warmth of that sunlight was the closing chapter of a 30-year nightmare. What followed over the next 6 months was a masterclass in the absolute, uncompromising delivery of justice. Marcus never saw the inside of a courtroom as a free man. With the offshore accounts immediately frozen by the federal government, he was denied the expensive, high-powered legal defense he screamed for. The golden boy of the Washington Empire was reduced to just another inmate number. He is currently serving a 20-year sentence in a maximum security federal prison for wire fraud, embezzlement, and attempted assault, completely stripped of the prestige he had tried to murder me to protect. Beatrice and Thomas fared no better in the outside world. The Atlanta black elite, a circle they had ruthlessly gatekept and worshipped for decades, exiled them overnight. The forensic audit liquidated every asset they possessed to repay the sterling loans and the corporate theft. Today, they reside in a cramped, low-income apartment on the outskirts of the city. Beatrice no longer wears custom wigs or hosts lavish galas. Thomas no longer presides over elite boardrooms. They are ghosts entirely shunned by the society that once defined their very existence. While their world burned to the ground, I rebuilt mine. Far from the toxic ruins of my parents' legacy, I stood on the pristine front porch of Big Mama's fully renovated estate. The peeling paint and rotting wood were gone, replaced by vibrant, modern, sunlit architecture. A large bronze plaque next to the front doors proudly displayed the new name, the Harrington Foundation. I had transformed our grandmother's home into a fully funded sanctuary and professional studio space for young, marginalized Black artists. Aunt Viv stood proudly by my side on opening day, her face radiant with a joy that had been absent for decades. As the Foundation's new executive director, she was finally leading with the grace, love, and authority she had always deserved. I sit here now, back in the present day, resting comfortably in the quiet luxury of my penthouse living room. The city skyline stretches out behind me, bathed in the soft glow of the late afternoon. The camera glides in a smooth, continuous arc around my chair, pushing in slowly to capture the absolute peace that has finally settled over my life. They say blood is thicker than water, but they forget that water is what nourishes a tree, while toxic blood will rot it from the roots up. My family thought they could cut me down to keep themselves warm. What they did not realize is that I am the entire forest. I lift the delicate porcelain cup and take a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. Lowering the cup, I give a sharp, deeply satisfied smile directly into the lens. The camera makes a quick, sudden push in, freezing on an extreme close-up of my eyes, bright, victorious, and completely unyielding. Fade to black.